Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 7, so let's get into it. You could say it all started out as an innocent prank, but that wouldn't strictly be true. Even Plum had to admit it wasn't all that innocent, and maybe, deep down, that was why she did it. Plum was president of the League, unelected but undisputed, and also its founder. In enlisting the others, she had presented the League as a glorious old breakbills tradition, which it actually wasn't, though, since breakbills had been around for something like 400 years, it seemed very likely to Plum that there must have been another League at some point in the past, or at any rate, something along the same general lines. You couldn't rule out the possibility, though, in actual fact, she got the idea from a P.G. Wodehouse story. The thing was this. Wharton was behaving badly, and in the judgment of the League, he would have to be pranked for it. Then, maybe, he would cut it out or behave a little less badly, or at least the League would have the satisfaction of having caused Wharton to suffer for his crimes. You couldn't call it innocent, but you had to admit it was pretty understandable. And anyway, was there even any such thing as an innocent prank? Plum loved breakbills. It was November of her senior year, and she still wasn't sick of it, not a bit. She loved its many and varied and intricate traditions and rituals and mythologies, with an unironic and boosterish love that she refused to be embarrassed about. If anything, she thought there should be more of them, which was one reason she started the League. They met after hours in a funny little trapezoidal study off the West Tower that, as far as Plum could tell, had fallen off the facility's magical security grid, so it was safe to break curfew there. She lay full length on her back on the floor, which was the position from which she usually conducted League business. The rest of the girls were scattered around the room on couches and chairs, limp and spent, like confetti from a successful but exhausting party that everybody was kind of relieved was now all but over. Plum made the room go silent. It was a little spell that ate sound in about a 10-yard radius. When Plum did a magic trick, everybody noticed. "Let's put it to a vote," she said gravely. "All those in favor of pranking Wharton, say aye." The ayes came back in a range of tones: righteous zeal, ironic detachment, sleepy acquiescence. From Plum's vantage point on the floor, with her eyes closed, her long brown hair splayed out in a fan on the carpet, which had once been soft and woolly, but which had been trodden down into a shiny, hard-packed gray. It sounded more or less unanimous. She dispensed with a show of nays. They were doing this. Wharton's crime was not a matter of life and death, but a stop would be put to it. This the League swore. Darcy, sitting slumped down on the couch, studied her reflection in a long mirror with a scarred gilt frame. She had a big, poofy 1970s afro. It even had an afro pick sticking out of it. She toyed with her image in the mirror. With both of her long, elegant brown hands, she worked a spell that stretched it and then squished it. Stretched, then squished. Stretch, squish. Her head blew up to the size of a beach ball. It stretched out like a sausage balloon. The technicalities were beyond Plum, but then mirror magic was Darcy's discipline. It was a bit show-offy of her, but it's not like Darcy had a lot of opportunities to use it. The facts of the Wharton case were as follows. At Breakbills, most serving duties at dinner were carried out by first years, who then ate separately afterward. But by tradition, one favored fourth year was chosen every year to serve as wine steward. in charge of pairings and pourings and whatnot, entrusted with the key to the wine closet. Wharton had had this honor bestowed upon him, and not for no reason. He did know a lot about wine. He did know a lot about wine. Or at any rate, he could remember the names of a whole lot of different regions and appellations and whatever else. But in the judgment of the League, Wharton had sinned against the honor of his office, sinned most grievously by systematically short-pouring the wine, especially for the fifth years, the Finns, in Breakbill's parlance, who were allowed 2 glasses each with dinner. Seriously, these were like 2/3 pours, everybody agreed. Plum wasn't much of a drinker personally, but the League took any threat to its wine supply seriously. For such a crime, there could be no forgiveness. "What do you suppose he does with it all?" Emma said. "Does with what?" "All that extra wine. He must be skimming it off. I bet he ends up with an extra bottle every night, off the books." There were 8 girls in the League, of whom 6 were present. Emma was the only second year. "I don't know," Plum said. "I guess he drinks it." "He couldn't get through a bottle a night," Darcy said. "He and his boyfriend, then. What's his name? It's Greek." Epiphanio? Darcy and Chelsea said it together. Chelsea lay on the couch at the opposite end from Darcy, knees drawn up, lazily trying to mess up Darcy's mirror tricks. It was always easier to screw up somebody else's spell than it was to cast one yourself. That was one of the many small unfairnesses of magic. Darcy frowned and concentrated harder, pushing back. The interference caused an audible buzz, and under the stress, Darcy's reflection twisted and spiraled in on itself. "Stop," she said. "You're going to break it." "He's probably got some permanent spell running that eats it up," Emma said. "Has to feed it wine once a day, like a virility thing." "Wait," Plum said. "You're suggesting that Wharton has a wine-powered spell going 24/7 on his penis?" "Well," Emma flushed mauve. She'd overstepped herself in the presence of her elders and betters. "You know, he's so buff." While everybody else was distracted by the question of Wharton's virility, Chelsea and Darcy's reflection caused Darcy's reflection to collapse in on itself, creepily, like it had gotten sucked into a black hole, and then to vanish altogether. In the mirror, it looked like she wasn't even there, except that the couch cushion was slightly depressed. "Ha!" Chelsea said. "Buff does not mean virile." That was Lucy, a pale and intensely philosophical Finn. Her tone betrayed a touch of what might have been the bitterness of personal experience. "Anyway, I bet he gives it to the ghost." "There is no ghost," Darcy said. Somebody was always saying that Breakbills had a ghost. It was a thing this year. There was practically a cult around it. Emma claimed to have seen it once, watching her through a window. Wharton said he had too. Plum secretly wanted a ghost sighting of her own, but you could never find it when you were looking for it. She wasn't completely convinced it existed. It was like saying there used to be a league. No one could prove it either way. "Come to that," Chelsea said. "What does virile mean?" "Means he's got spunk in his junk," Darcy said. "Girls, please," Plum said. "Neither Wharton's spunk nor his junk is germane here. The question is what to do about the missing wine. Who's got a plan?" "You've got a plan," Darcy and Chelsea said at the same time again. The two of them were like stage twins. It was true. Plum always had a plan. Her brain just seemed to secret them naturally, leaving her no choice but to share them with the world around her. She had a bit of a manic streak. Plum's plan was to take advantage of what she perceived to be Wharton's Achilles heel, which was his pencils. He didn't use the school-issued ones, which, as far as Plum was concerned, were entirely functional and sufficient unto the day. Deep brakebills blue in color, with brakebills in gold letters down the side. But Wharton didn't like them. He said they were too fat. He didn't like their hand feel. The lead was mushy. He brought his own from home instead, very expensive ones. In truth, Wharton's personal pencils were remarkable, olive green and made from some hard, oily, aromatic wood that released a waxy aroma reminiscent of distant exotic rainforest trees. The erasers were bound in rings of a dull gray brush steel that looked too industrial and high carbon for the task of merely containing the erasers, which were, instead of the usual fleshy pink, a light devouring black. He kept them in a flat silver case like a cigarette case, which also contained, in its own crushed velvet nest, a little knife that he used to keep them sharpened to wicked points. Plus, he must have been into debate or academic decathlon or something in some earlier stage of his life, because he was always doing these pencil tricks with them, of the kind generally used to intimidate rival mathletes. He did them constantly, unconsciously, and apparently involuntarily. It was annoying. Plum's plan was for the League to steal the pencils and hold them for ransom, the ransom being an explanation of what the hell Wharton did with all that wine, along with a pledge to stop doing same. By 11:30 that night the League was yawning, and Darcy and Chelsea had restored Darcy's reflection and then begun wrangling with it all over again. But the groundwork had been laid. The plan had been fully explained, fleshed out, approved, improved, and then made needlessly complex. Cruel, curly little barbs had been added to it, and all roles had been assigned. It was rough justice, but someone had to enforce order at Brakebills, and if the faculty didn't, then the League's many hands were forced. The administration might turn a blind eye, if it chose, but the League's many eyes were sharp and unblinking. Darcy's image shivered and blurred, trapped between spell and counterspell like a teacup in a vice. "Stop it," Darcy said, really annoyed now. "I told you—" She had told her, and now it did. The mirror broke with a loud, sharp tick, like one forward increment of a clock's works. Bless you. A shatter-white star appeared in the lower right-hand corner of the glass, surrounded by concentric rings and spreading fracture tendrils. For some reason, it made Plum uncomfortable. For a moment, she felt like the little room was a bathysphere that had reached crush depth. The windows were cracking, and the cold, heavy, mindless ocean was about to come pouring in. "Oh, shit," Chelsea said. Her hands flew to her mouth. "I hope that wasn't, super expensive." Plum got up at 8 in the morning, late by her standards, but instead of rejuvenating her brain, the extra sleep had just made it all muzzy. It had smeared all those clear thoughts she was supposed to be having all over the inside of her skull. Her depressive tendency, the flip side of her manic streak, was stirring. Why were they even doing this? It wanted to know. What a waste of time, of effort, of pencils. Plum needed to get moving, but she was having trouble attaching meanings to things. The meanings kept peeling off like old stickers. As a Finn who'd finished her required coursework, Plum was taking all seminars that semester, and her first class was a colloquium on period magic. 15th century continental, to be specific. Lots of elemental stuff and weird divination techniques on Johannes Hartlieb. Holly, a fellow leaguer, moon-faced and pretty, except for one ear, which was covered in a port wine birthmark, sat opposite her across the table, and such was Plum's smeary state that Holly had to touch her sharp little nose meaningfully twice before Plum remembered that that was the signal that stages 1 and 2 of the plan had been completed successfully. Stage 1, crude but effective. A few hours earlier, Chelsea's boyfriend would have smuggled her into the boys' tower under pretense of a pre-dawn sex date. Nature having taken its course, Chelsea would have gone to Wharton's door, pressed her back against it, touched her fingers to her temples in a gesture so habitual that she no longer knew she did it, rolled her eyes back into her head, and entered his room in a wispy, silvery astral state. Chelsea did it all the same. Astral projection was her discipline. But it was still one of the most flat-out beautiful pieces of magic Plum had ever seen. Chelsea tossed the room for the pencil case, found it, and grasped it with both of her barely substantial hands. She couldn't get the pencil case out of the room that way, but she didn't have to. All she had to do was lift it up to where it could be seen in the window. Wharton himself might or might not have been watching this, depending on whether or not he was asleep, but it mattered not. Let him see. Because once Chelsea got the case over by the window, Ernest Lucy had line of sight to it from a window in an empty lecture hall in the wing opposite Wharton's room, which meant she could teleport the pencil case in that direction from inside Wharton's room to midair outside it. 3 feet was about as far as she could jump it, but that was plenty. Thank God for people with actual useful disciplines. The pencil case would then fall 40 feet to where Emma waited shivering in the bushes in the cold November pre-dawn to catch it in a blanket. No magic required. Effective? Undeniably. Needlessly complex? Perhaps. But needless complexity was the League's signature. That was how the League rolled. Then it was on to stage 2, Breakfast of Champions. Wharton would descend late, having spent the morning frantically searching his room, though, through a fog of anxiety, he would barely notice that his morning oatmeal had been plunked down in front of him, not by some anonymous first year, but by the purple-eared Holly, in guise of same. The first mouthful would not sit right with him. He would stop and examine his morning oatmeal more closely. It would be garnished, not with the usual generous pinches of brown sugar, but with a light dusting of aromatic olive green pencil shavings, compliments of the League. As the day wore on, Plum got into the spirit of the prank. She'd known she would. It was mostly just her mornings that were bad. It took a lot of energy to keep being Plum. Some days, she just needed a few hours to get up to speed. Her schedule ground forward, accelerated, advanced kinetics, quantum grammary, joined hands, tandem magics, manipulation of ligneous plants. Plum's course load would have been daunting for a doctoral candidate, possibly several doctoral candidates, but Plum had arrived at Brakebills with a head full of more magical theory and practice than most people left with. She wasn't one of these standing starters, the cold openers who reeled through their first year with aching hands and eyes full of stars. Plum was clever, and Plum had come to Brakebills prepared. As the only accredited college for magic on the North American continent, Brakebills had a very large applicant pool to draw from, and it drank that pool dry. Technically, nobody really applied here. Dean Fogg simply skimmed the cream of high school seniors off the top. The cream of the cream, the outliers, the extreme cases of precocious genius and obsessive motivation, the statistical freaks who had the brains and the high pain tolerance that the study of magic required. Fogg took them aside and made them an offer they couldn't refuse, or, at any rate, if they could refuse it, they wouldn't remember it. Privately, Plum thought they could put a tiny bit more emphasis in the selection process on emotional intelligence, along with the other kind. The Brakebill student body was a bit of a psychological menagerie. Carrying that much on-board cognitive processing power had a way of distorting your personality and to actually want to work that hard. You had to be at least a little bit screwed up. Plum's discipline was camouflage magic, the magic of concealment, and she was considered an illusionist, which she was perfectly happy about. Being an illusionist at Brakebills was, if Plum said it herself, a pretty sweet deal. You got to hang out in a tiny invisible folly castle on the edge of the forest that was quite difficult to find unless you had an illusionist-type discipline. The castle was delicate and gossamer and very Neuschwanstein, which was a nice way of saying, though Plum didn't say it, kind of Disney. To get up in one of the towers, you climbed a ladder inside it, like you were negotiating a Jeffries tube. And there was just enough room for a little chair and a desk inside the round room at the top. She didn't like to be partition about it, but it was way better than that pokey cottage the physical kids got stuck with. When they had parties, the whole place could be made to twinkle and float up into the air, a little ways like a fairy castle, connected to the ground by only a rickety, railingless staircase, which people were always falling off of drunk onto the soft grass below. It reminded her of the floating castle at the end of the Phantom toll booth. Hell yes, it was Disney. Disney for the win. Once in a while, people would ask Plum what the hell kind of adolescence she'd had that she arrived at Brakebill so cocked, locked, and ready to rock. She told them the truth, which was that she'd grown up on an island near Seattle in comfortable surroundings, the daughter of a mixed marriage, one magician, one non. She was an only child, and they'd had high standards for Plum, Daddy especially. He was the magician of the couple. As the one basket they'd managed to weave, she had to hold all their eggs, so they'd homeschooled her, and once her talent for magic revealed itself, they'd made damn sure she made good on it. Daddy sat with her and made her practice her languages and her exercises, and she'd made very good indeed. True, she'd never been to prom or played a competitive sport that you couldn't play sitting down and in complete silence, but you don't make a magic omelet without breaking some magic eggs. That was the truth, and if she liked and trusted the people who asked, she would add that, yes, it was kind of a lot to deal with. Her outward effect was bright and capable, and that was no illusion, but equally real was the yawning pit of exhaustion inside her. She just felt so tired sometimes, and because of everything her family asked of her, she was ashamed of being tired. She would not let the pit swallow her up as much as she sometimes wanted it to. She could have gone on to say even more, which was that magic ran in her family, sort of. That it was something of a tradition, but she never did. People tended to be a bit funny about it, and actually Plum felt a bit funny about it too, so she kept it to herself. It wasn't hard because she'd lived most of her life in America and had not even a trace of an English accent. And it was on her mother's side, so Chatwin wasn't even her last name. It was her mother's name, though. She was the daughter of Rupert Chatwin's only son, and that made Plum, as far as she knew, the last living direct descendant of the famous Chatwins of the Fillory books. No one else in the generation had managed to reproduce, so she was the heir to whatever Chatwins were heir to, though, as she was not slow to point out, she wasn't a Chatwin at all, but a Purkis. Plum Polson Purkis. Chatwin wasn't even her middle name. And as a matter of fact, there had been a sum of money, royalties that Plover had graciously set aside for the children who'd made his fortune. His second fortune. He'd been rich already when he started writing about Fillory. Rupert had used his share to buy a big house in the countryside outside Penzance, which he barely ever left, until the army called him up to die in World War II. Plum had seen pictures of it, one of those houses that always gets referred to as a pile, a big Gregorian pile. It had a name, but she'd forgotten it. Her mother had grown up there, but she didn't talk much about her childhood. A drafty, echoing place with how she described it. Not a place to be a kid in. The floor was littered with falls of plaster from the crumbling moldings, and Plum's mother spent winter afternoons huddled up on the stairs by a huge heating duct, big enough for her to have crawled into if the entrance hadn't been covered by a knotted, wrought iron gate, and letting the lukewarm air wash weakly over her. When she grew up, Plum's mother left her heritage behind. Her Chatwin ancestors struck her as dangerously melancholy and fanciful, and she sold the house and its contents and moved to America to become a publicist for Microsoft. She met Plum's dad at a charity ball, and it wasn't till they were well into their courtship that he revealed to her what he really did in all his spare time. Once Mom got over the shock of a lifetime, they went ahead and got married anyway and had Plum. And they were a happy, magical, nuclear family. You couldn't talk about the Fillory stuff at Brakebills. Everybody loved Fillory. It was their most precious childhood fantasy. They used to run around their backyards or basement rec rooms or whatever they ran around in, pretending they were Martin Chatwin, a boy hero of a magical world of green fields and talking animals where they would attain total and complete self-actualization. And Plum got that, totally and completely. It was their fantasy, and it was perfect and innocent and true, at least in the way that such things were true. She would never try to take that away from them. And literally everybody at Brakebills grew up on Fillory. The place was one big 5-year Fillory convention. But Plum, through whose very veins the mighty blood of the Chatwins flowed, did not grow up on Fillory. They didn't even have the books. Plum had only read the first one, The World in the Walls, and that was on the sly, in snatches at the public library. Plum's parents didn't smoke, didn't drink, and they didn't read Christopher Plover. Plum didn't mind. Once you found out that magic was real, fictional wonderlands were pretty small change by comparison, so she quietly opted out of a public life as the last scion of the Chatwin line. She could do without the fuss. Being the living incarnation of the most innocent, ardent childhood fantasies of pretty much everybody you met was not actually a gift from the gods. But there was more to it than that. There always had been. Underneath her mother's scorn and indifference, there was something else, and Plum wasn't completely sure, but she thought it might be fear. Fillory had made the Chatwin family famous, but most people didn't know, or they knew but chose not to think about it, that it had ruined them too. Martin, Plum's great-uncle, High King and hero of the Fillory books, had disappeared when he was 13. He was never found. Jane, the youngest, the Moppet, vanished when she was the same age. The others survived, more or less, but no one came out of it unscathed. Helen changed her name and ended her life in an evangelical Christian in Texas. Fiona Chatwin got along by never once mentioning Fillory as an adult. When pressed on the subject, she exhibited faint surprise and claimed she'd never heard of it. As for Rupert, Plum's great-grandfather, he was, by all accounts, a wreck of a man who spent his adult life in neurotic seclusion until Field Marshal Erwin Rommel came along to put him out of his misery. Something had happened to that family. There was a curse on them, and its name was Fillory. Plum's mom talked about Fillory like it was almost real. Maybe it was the books, maybe it was Plover, maybe it was the parents, or the war, or fate. But when Fillory and Earth the collision was pure damage, and the Chatwins were the point of contact. They were right there at ground zero, and they were blown to vapor, like the human shadows at Hiroshima. Plum was pretty sure that none of them had attained total or even partial self-actualization. Plum's mother wanted no part of that, and a good thing too as far as Plum was concerned, because deep down she felt the fear too. When Plum discovered magic, it was the most magnificent kind of surprise, the kind that never got less surprising. The world was even more interesting than she thought it was, but it also made her uneasy. Because just speaking logically here, if magic was real, then could you still be absolutely 100% positive that Fillory wasn't? And if Fillory was real, which it almost certainly wasn't, then whatever it was that had torn through an entire generation of her family like a lion through a flock of loitering gazelle was real too. And it might still be out there. Plum dug into magic with both hands, but always at the back of her mind was the thought that she might go too far, dig too deep, and dig up something that she would wish had stayed buried. She especially thought about that when those depressive anhedonic chemicals were singing in her bloodstream, because then she kind of wanted to dig it up. She wanted to look it in the face. She could hear Fillory calling to her. Or, if not Fillory, then something, somewhere beautiful and distant and siren-like, where she had never been, but that was also somehow home. And she knew what side of the family her depressive streak came from. That was her Chatwin inheritance right there. So she kept her Chatwinny to herself. She didn't want people pushing at it, picking at it, lest its ragged, unstable edges start to unravel. Sometimes Plum wondered if there was a way to use her discipline to hide not just things, but words, facts, names, feelings, hide them so well that even she couldn't find them. What she wanted was to hide herself from herself, but she couldn't. That was stupid. You were who you were. You lived your life. You didn't brood. Ruminative thinking. That's what her shrink had called it. You got on with things. You founded the League. You pranked the hell out of Wharton. Plum wound up having a pretty good day. At any rate, it was a lot better than Wharton's. In first period, he found more pencil shavings on the seat of his chair. Walking to lunch, he found his pockets stuffed full of jet black pencil eraser rubbings. It was like a horror movie. His precious pencils were being tortured to death, minute by minute, in an undisclosed location, and he was powerless to save them. He would rue his short pouring days, so he would. Passing Wharton by chance in a courtyard, Plum let her eyes slide past with a slow smile she felt only a little bit bad about. Was it her imagination, or did he look just the slightest bit haunted? Maybe Breakbills did have a ghost after all. Maybe it was Plum. Finally, and this was Plum's touch, and she privately thought it was the deftest one, in his fourth period class, a practicum on diagramming magical energies, Wharton found that the Breakbills pencil he was using, on top of its bad hand feel and whatever else, wouldn't draw what he wanted it to. Whatever spell he tried to diagram, whatever points and rays and vectors he tried to sketch, they inevitably formed a series of letters. The letters spelled out compliments of the League. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 8.